name is Sam Harton. I'm a senior attorney at Romanucci and Blandon, and I'm here today to talk about issues involving people who are incarcerated and suffering from serious mental illness. And this is a topic that I could talk for hours about, and I talk about it every day to anyone who will listen because it's so important, not just to my work, but to our communities and our society. Well, it's really hard to overstate the degree to which mass incarceration has changed the way we respond to all sorts of social problems. Um, Mass incarceration really ramped up in the 80s and in the 90s. And since then, it's really transformed how we respond to so many things. Poverty, it's changed the way we respond to interpersonal conflict, and it's really transformed the way we respond to mental illness. Before mass incarceration, there were more community-based solutions to mental health, and there were more therapeutic settings for people where therapy and treatment were the focus as opposed to rehabilitation and punishment. Now, that's not to say what we were doing in the 60s and 70s regarding mental illness was perfect, but right now, the entire context by which we treat mental illness has changed because prisons and jails have become the number one provider of mental health treatment in this country. One of the biggest questions I get asked when I start talking about these things is, what's the distinction between jails and prisons? And they can actually be very, very different, although every correctional facility has its own policies and sort of chains of command and just the way it works on a day-to-day basis. So a jail is going to be typically run by a city government or a county government, and it's localized, and the jails are going to be like the first place that someone goes after they're arrested. So most people that are incarcerated in a jail are waiting for their trial. They're what's called a pretrial detainee. Jails do sometimes incarcerate people who have just been convicted or sentenced or are maybe serving a shorter sentence and they don't need to be transferred to a prison. But when someone is sentenced to a longer sentence, they typically go to a prison. And a prison is typically going to be run by a state government or we have a federal Bureau of Prisons, which runs our federal prisons throughout this country. Here in Illinois, the state prisons are run by the Illinois Department of Corrections. And that one entity, the Department of Corrections, manages, over a dozen prisons throughout the state, whereas a county or a jail is typically only, unless it's, a bigger county, a bigger city, a county or a city is typically going to be managing their local facility. I think the biggest myth when it comes to people who are incarcerated and have self-harmed or ended their life inside of a prison is that the jail or the prison couldn't have done anything to prevent it. That's not true. Suicide is actually one of the leading causes of death inside of local jails. There have been some years where suicide has been the leading cause of death inside of jails throughout our country. And that's because, we over-incarcerate people suffering from mental illness and people who are suffering an acute crisis related to their mental illness. And so when our default response to mental illness is to throw them in jail, we're really putting those people at risk. And then the sort of second facet to that, second reason why suicide is so common inside of jails is because those jails aren't equipped to handle that task, that responsibility of being the mental health provider in their community. The problem is they're required to be because they house so many people who are suffering from mental illness, who are experiencing an acute crisis. They are tasked with treating those people and providing resources to those people and keeping those people safe. But it's not a therapeutic setting, and it doesn't have all the resources that we would need to treat most serious mental illnesses. Because we're over-incarcerating, and then on the other hand, we're not actually providing the resources to the mentally ill people that we're incarcerating, it really creates a dangerous situation where people get into jail and they self-harm or worse. When we're talking about the resources that we're providing to people who are experiencing mental illness inside of a jail or a prison, one of the biggest things is staffing. As an attorney working on cases involving incarcerated people who have been hurt inside of jails and prisons, I take the testimony and depose correctional officers and other jail staff on a weekly basis. And pretty much every single case that I have can be sort of placed into two buckets. One is a situation where the jail just wasn't staffed appropriately. We didn't have enough people. We had plenty of correctional officers, but we didn't have any mental health staff. We didn't have any medical staff. We didn't have the right kind of personnel to address this person's problem. Or maybe we didn't have enough correctional officers, and so we weren't doing our security checks, and we weren't, identifying that, hey, this person is safe every 15 minutes because they need to be on a heightened watch because they're suffering from a crisis. That's sort of one bucket. The second one is apathy. Sometimes there's enough staff, but the culture within that jail or the prison is one of just not really caring or understanding the weight of the responsibility of a correctional officer. I once deposed it wasn't actually in a prison, it was in a state-run mental facility, which operates very similar to a prison and is operated by the same government as the Department of Corrections. I once deposed the person who was supposed to be checking on the deceased person in my case. She was supposed to check on him every 15 minutes to make sure he was safe, and she didn't. And when I asked her, what made you decide to start working for a mental health facility? What did you get? I was thinking she might give me some. I really wanted to work with, vulnerable populations. I was really passionate about this issue. She told me that it just had better benefits than her last job. She had never worked in a mental health setting before. And so, not that there's anything wrong with taking a job that has good benefits, but a lot of times we get people in these roles, in these really, really important roles where they're responsible for the safety of vulnerable people, and they don't have a particular interest in doing that job. They're not trained on how to, protect these people. And it's not really the weight of that job, how important that job is not communicated to them. They don't understand the consequences if they don't do their job. If they were working at, the grocery store beforehand, if they don't do their job right, maybe someone doesn't get their eggs scanned. At this job, if they don't do their job right, someone could die. And that sense of urgency is not always communicated to correctional staff, mental health staff who are working in these correctional settings.